Thank you all very much for coming. It's always a pleasure to be giving a talk to SSEES, my alma mater. As Safa mentioned, I spent an amazing 3 years there as an undergraduate student. And my career path did keep me focused on Eastern Europe even afterwards during my master's, and currently in my PhD. I'm no longer at an area studies department, but I'm still very much focused on East European countries, so there is still some continuity there. So given the countries that I'm covering, I hope this talk will be interesting for an audience that specializes in Eastern Europe. And I see that we have quite a diverse group of people in the audience, so I'm very happy about that. Apologies if some of the aspects that I'll cover are a little too technical in terms of the demography angle. And also for some of you who are demography specialists, they might actually be too slow, but we'll hopefully strike a good balance between people who are more interested in the political science aspect and the demography-minded ones, if you like. So, with that in mind, I believe you can all see my screen. Okay. So, the presentation that I'll be giving today is focused on one of the 4 chapters of my DPhil thesis, which is very much ongoing. I started my DPhil at the University of Oxford last autumn. So this is by no means a finished project, which means I'm very much open to criticism. But yes, so let's first look at a broad overview of what I'm doing. So my entire DPhil work or PhD work is focused on pronatalism in Eastern Europe. But I'm approaching it from 3 different angles. So I'm looking at the discursive representation, how policymakers talk about pronatalism, then the policy manifestation, what is it that they do in the name of pronatalism, and then finally the fertility effects, which I will be looking at next year in my research. So maybe probably the most important question, do these pronatalist policies actually work or not? And again, the chapter or the paper that I'm presenting today is this second part of the thesis, which is about the kind of financial support that is available for parents, not only in Eastern Europe, in Europe as a whole, but with special emphasis, as you will see later, on some East European countries. But before I delve into the specific topic, I wanted to, for those of you who are not very well versed in demography or social policy, I wanted to provide a broad overview of population trends. So you can see here the United Nations population projections, which are usually seen as the most credible source on this. And there is some debate here, but scholars agree that the world will keep growing for quite some time. They are less in agreement on when it will stop growing. So it might happen within our lifetime, it might not, but eventually it will stop growing, and the curve is already flattening, as you can see here. So we are still growing in terms of the world population as a whole, but not at the same pace as we were in the past. So moving on to the next slide, you can see that even though the world as a whole will keep growing, it will be very uneven between continents. So Europe, which you can see here in yellow, used to have a much larger share of the world's population, but now in relative terms, and also in absolute terms, but especially in relative terms, it is declining, and it will continue to decline at the expense of other continents, Asia, and especially Africa, which will sort of take over as time goes on. So the world will look very different in 80 years, but also even in 30 to 40 years. The demographic makeup is very much changing. So why is any of this important? Well, it might seem, right, that based on the previous slide, we should be worried about overpopulation, perhaps, because we already have a lot of people and we're dealing with issues such as climate change, and these issues will be exacerbated, right, if the population keeps growing indefinitely. But then we see that even though that might be a concern for many countries in Asia and Africa, in Europe and in North America as well, we're already very concerned about underpopulation or depopulation. So here I have the so-called old age dependency ratio. which shows the number of pensioners in a given population compared to the number of working people in a given population. And we basically want this ratio to be as low as, well, not as low as possible, but ideally demographers usually assume 25 to 100, right? So you want 25 pensioners for 100 employees, 100 workers, because you want each pensioner to be supported by 4 working age people. But already in countries like Italy, for example, as you can see here, that ratio has been exceeded. And this will keep growing very dramatically with population aging over the coming years. So what's perhaps a little encouraging, nonetheless, for Eastern Europe on this map is that in Eastern Europe, the situation is not as dire. So population aging has started in Eastern Europe as well, but it's a more recent phenomenon than it is in Western Europe. So you can see that, generally speaking, the countries in the East are brighter in this map, brighter blue, and then darker blue, usually Western and especially Southern Europe. Although, yes, I mean, in countries like Bulgaria, you can see that it's already quite dire, but Eastern Europe might not have to worry about this yet, some would argue. But then when we look at the fertility rates on the continent, and of course, that's what I'm most interested in, we see a very different picture. So fertility is quite low across Europe. It's below replacement level, below 2.1 children per woman, right? The rate that is necessary for a population to sustain itself, to sustain its current size. It's already below that everywhere. Kosovo, I believe, was the last country to drop below that 2.1 level. But within Europe, between countries, there are still a lot of differences. And it's not the same if your fertility rate is 1.9 and if it's 1.2 or 3. So there are a lot of differences, and the differences are quite different and even opposite, perhaps, from what we saw earlier. So here it is Eastern and Southern Europe which are facing the bigger problem because fertility is even lower in these countries. So you see the pink and kind of whitish countries. And in the United Kingdom and in Scandinavia and in some other West European countries, fertility is still relatively resilient, so quite close to the 2.1 level. So even if East European countries, again, I'm making a generalization here, it also depends on the exact country, but as a whole, even if the region doesn't have to worry about population aging a lot today, it will probably have to worry even more than Western Europe does in the coming decades, at least based on fertility trends. And of course, there is also immigration, right? The biggest, perhaps, demographic threat to East European countries. And then when you take all those phenomena into account, you get numbers like these. So this is a list of the countries that are expected to lose the largest shares of their populations in the next 3 decades. And as you can see here, these are all East European countries. So within our lifetimes, these countries will look very different because based on current population trends, at least, they will lose about a quarter of their population. And I haven't just selected these European countries from the table. This is literally the top 10 countries. So they're all East European. Again, due to low fertility, but also due to high immigration. And just to show one particularly dramatic case study, Bulgaria used to have a very similar population size as Niger and Iraq back in 1950. Since then, these countries have literally gone in the opposite direction. So now we see the first 2 countries achieving very high population numbers, whereas Bulgaria has been declining. And Bulgaria is the East European country that has lost the most population since the collapse of socialism. So again, very tectonic, if you like, demographic changes. And with that in mind, we can move on to my topic, to what I'm interested in. So pronatalism and how countries are trying to deal with these phenomena. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just to provide an overview, pronatalist measures can take many forms. Historically, the one that has been the most salient is, of course, illiberal pronatalism. So we have these very unfortunate examples, such as the childlessness tax in Ceausescu's Romania, And you can see some other examples here. Abortion, of course, is the example that even today we're most familiar with, which can, of course, I mean, restrictive policies on abortion can be driven by other considerations as well, not just pronatalism, but they do result in more children on average. So we can think of all these measures as illiberal ways to influence fertility by targeting non-parents rather than parents. On the other hand, we have liberal pronatalism, and this would then refer in the literature to all positive, if you like, measures directed towards parents, towards facilitating parenthood, rather than towards punishing non-parenthood. And there is this fairly straightforward definition using public policy to help those who already want to have children to do so. So there are other theoretical concepts that we can use in this regard. Some of you might be familiar with Isaiah Berlin's positive freedom, right? So the state is not only supposed to protect individuals from various threats to their freedom, but also to very kind of affirmatively, proactively enable them to realize their desires. So that would also then extend to the desire to have a child. The literature on childbearing preferences is very interesting in the field of demography, because it shows that in most countries, people prefer to have more children than they're actually having. And often it goes up to a full additional child that people say in surveys, at least. Of course, we can't really know how accurate the measurement is, but they at least declare the intention to, if circumstances were different, to have about a full additional child than they actually have or end up having. And there is also the happiness literature, which says that, even though this one is a little more contested, but the consensus is that children either make people happier or at least don't make them less happy, if you like. So a lot of then kind of liberal, if you like, reasons to do pronatalist policies for those individuals who are already willing to have a child or multiple children. And then what does family policy have to tell us about this? Well, in recent years, family policies have expanded very dramatically. So cash benefits, but also parental leave and childcare have grown tremendously across developed countries. Cash benefits, even in relative terms, compared to the other two, have grown a lot, especially even more recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll see, of course, if this trend outlives the pandemic. But what's interesting is that despite this very kind of uniform story of growth, in relative terms, child benefits still only replace a fraction of child costs in most countries. So usually, even if a third of costs are replaced, parents are happy in most developed countries. So it's nowhere near sufficient. Welfare states don't even set this objective for themselves to cover the whole financial cost of having children. Which brings me to my core concept, which is extrinsic pronatalism, as we saw earlier in the title. So the reason I believe this deserves to be conceptualized as a separate type of pronatalism is because recently we've been seeing in some European countries a fairly unprecedented trend, right? Where these child benefits, which are usually nowhere near sufficient, are now, for some households at least, becoming over-sufficient or over-generous, if you like, in the sense that they can exceed the realistic cost or the estimated cost of having children. And of course, again, I'm speaking only about the financial cost. Now, how are these extrinsic child benefits special? Well, the first one is already obvious. So generosity surplus, again, for some specific families, they provide more money than is realistically needed, but also in some other respects, such as timing bias. So these are benefits that are disproportionately geared towards younger children, which contradicts the actual distribution of child costs over time. In the social policy literature, it has been demonstrated many times in many countries that child costs grow over time as the child becomes older. And yet these policies provide more generosity in earlier ages. So then the third feature would be parity bias, again, in contradiction with the social policy literature, because as you have more children, you need less money for each individual child as a parent due to economies of scale, because you save a lot of expenses, right? And yet, extrinsic child benefits actually provide more money for additional children, usually third children and beyond. So if a certain child benefit system has all these three features, we should regard it, I argue, as extrinsic, as exercising a potential extrinsic incentive for parents to have a child, for people to have a child, even if they didn't necessarily consider doing so before. So just an overview again, illiberal, liberal, and extrinsic would then be the three types of pronatalism. I think illiberal is obviously quite different, so the distinction should be clear because it is only targeted at non-parents. Liberal and extrinsic both target parents, but they target them very differently. Again, liberal pronatalism would seek to partly or fully meet the child cause, but not exceed it. And it would follow the time logic and the birth order logic of how that support should be distributed, whereas the extrinsic package would contradict it. So how did I go about studying this in my research? I'm not going to bore you with the details. I'm trying to keep the presentation non-technical. But very briefly, I used the OECD tax band simulator, which provides information on any, well, not any, but most of the family-related support available in developed countries. And then on the cost side, I took the European Commission budget standards data from 2020, which are unfortunately not available for all EU countries. So I had to make some adjustments as well, but they're still fairly useful. And then I use this method called the fuzzy set ideal type analysis, a fairly simple configurational method. Some of you might be familiar with QCA, right? FSATA would be like a more elementary version of that. And I applied this method to 10 countries in Europe, which I'm about to show you in the next slide, with the goal of dividing them, categorizing them in 8 different ideal types based on whether they have these extrinsic child benefits that I'm interested in. So we still have the same 3 features, right? Generosity surplus, timing bias, and parity bias. The idea is that if a country meets all these 3 criteria, then we should regard it as highly extrinsic. If it only meets 2 of them, doesn't matter which 2, so generosity and timing, or timing and parity, etc. Moderate, and then you can see the rest. Slightly extrinsic, and then if it meets none of the criteria, it's basically not extrinsic, so we shouldn't even conceptualize it in this regard. Again, before I move on to my results, this is a relatively rare phenomenon, especially on the generosity side of things. So as we know from the history of child benefits, they tend to be insufficient, let alone over generous, right? So we don't expect this to be the case in many countries, but it is still worth exploring. So which countries am I looking at, and how did I select them? Well, my primary criterion was whether those countries themselves call themselves pronatalist or not. And conveniently enough, the United Nations asks governments this exact same question every 10 years. And the last time they did this survey, 60% of European countries declare themselves to be dissatisfied with their current fertility rate and to have undertaken a specific policy intervention to increase their birth rate. 60% of all European countries is a lot of countries, so I wanted to narrow that down further. So then I thought, well, maybe if fertility is particularly low, then this kind of extrinsic phenomenon would be more likely. So then I used 1.45 children per woman as a threshold, as a 5-year average, so to have this this or lower than this level in the last 5 years. And that's how I got the following 7 countries that you can see in the slide: Croatia, Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Poland, Portugal, and Spain. But then I realized that if I only use this threshold, then I'm ignoring some very interesting East European countries, which we already know from the literature. You can see these references here, do have a pronatalist policy. So based on case knowledge, I have also added Belarus, Hungary, and Serbia to my sample and arrived at a total of 10 European countries. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I've actually added this slide specifically for this presentation, given the Eastern Europe focus of most of the audience, but you will be familiar with all five of these people. I suppose they currently have generous child benefits with a pronatalist rationale, and they are the ones that have either introduced it or very dramatically expanded their child benefit system. So they're all very important with regards to pronatalism. They're not all the same. So Serbia, Belarus, and Poland focus mostly on cash support. Russia has cash support and subsidies, which are usually used for housing. And then Hungary has both cash and subsidies. But the cash is mostly provided in the form of tax support as a tax relief, right? So it is very controversial in that regard because it is disproportionately beneficial to wealthier individuals. But yes, in one form or another, they have all embarked on a pronatalist policy course. And then before I show you the results, I looked at, as I said earlier, all three features, generosity, timing, and then parity for two types of households. So low income, very vulnerable household. And according to the OECD tax bond simulator, these are the households that one can look at. And then the second one that is approximated by the simulator is the middle income household, sort of average wage by both parents. And then child age, OECD provides data for all minors, but I looked at 2, 9, and 17 to sort of give like a broad overview. And then birth orders from first to fourth children. So it was a fairly complex and multi-layered analysis in the end. And with that in mind, let's look at the results. So again, expectedly, extrinsic outcomes are not incredibly common, even for these low and middle income household. Maybe of course, for a high income household, it would be even less because it wouldn't exceed the cost that those parents face in terms of having children. But only 13% of the households analyzed have extrinsic outcomes for generosity. So in only 13% of them, the support provided exceeds the cost of having children, the estimated cost. By income, again, as you would expect, this happens more for the low income household than for the middle income household. By age, the discrepancy is perhaps the starkest because governments cannot sustain such generous policies over a long time. So they mainly provide them, or they provide them more generously in the first 2 years of the child's life. And then by birth order, it is fairly balanced, but you will still see that third and fourth children are disproportionately targeted. So they take most of the extrinsic outcomes for generosity. And that brings us to the most important table, which summarizes the overall results. So not only based on generosity, but also based on timing and parity, which just means, birth order, first, second, third, or fourth children. We get these results. So before we look at the countries, let me just explain. So if a country like Belarus, for example, is highly extrinsic with extrinsic results for all three criteria, that means that Belarus exceeds the cost of having children for a significant number of the model households. Again, I'm not getting into the technical details of the method for the sake of simplicity, but that's the reasoning behind it. And then for timing, it provides more generous support when the child is younger. And then for parity, it provides more generous support for third and fourth children. So the four countries that are considered highly extrinsic meet all these three criteria. And three of them are East European: Belarus, Serbia, and Hungary. We also have Portugal in there. We don't have Poland, even though Poland is very generous, as you can see, but Poland doesn't do timing bias. So in Poland, the support is relatively constant over the course of childhood. It doesn't discriminate positively towards younger children. What was really interesting was that all 10 countries, East European or West European, high generosity countries, low generosity countries, doesn't matter. All 10 of them were actually extrinsic for parity, which means that all 10 prioritize third and fourth children, which I found perhaps a little surprising. For timing, it is also very geared towards younger children. So 7 or 8, I believe, of the 10 countries were extrinsic for timing as well. But because most of them weren't extrinsic for generosity, apart from the first 4 and Poland, we didn't get a lot of highly extrinsic results overall, because the FSITA method requires positive results on all 3 criteria. So quite a balanced picture. But these 4 countries, again, 3 of them East European, stand out in terms of their generosity and therefore also their overall extrinsicness. So let's just conclude very briefly. Why does any of this matter? Well, I'm sure you'll have different questions based on your fields, because again, this topic can be approached from many different disciplines. But for demography, it probably matters in one main respect, and that's the million-dollar question for demographers. Do fertility policies actually work? Do people have more children as a result of policy? And the consensus so far is that it doesn't really make a difference most of the time, or at least it doesn't make a significant difference, or at least it doesn't justify the investment. So this is a very cost-ineffective way of raising the fertility rate. You can't do it with money. It's more complicated than that. You have to enable a better contextual, if you like, environment for parents. But of course, most of those analyses have looked at non-extrinsic child benefits, because extrinsic child benefits, with some notable historical exceptions such as France, are very new. So perhaps this consensus would look different in a couple of years if these extrinsic packages persist, and especially if they expand to other countries as well. And then for social policy, it's hard to decide if we should be happy about this phenomenon or not, because on the one hand, it might lower the pro-elderly welfare spending bias. So I don't know how much people are familiar with this, but usually in most developed countries, especially in Europe, governments spend much more on the elderly, often for very logical and justifiable reasons, but it is a very large gap, and it has been growing recently. So this phenomenon might help make that gap narrower. Then it might also mitigate post-transfer vertical income inequality. We all know that inequality is very large and growing actually in developed countries, in most developed countries. Now, importantly, these packages are usually, because they're pronatalist, they want everybody to have more children. They're not more generous for poorer, for lower income households, but as a percentage of household income, they make more of a difference, of course, for lower income households. So they can definitely end up mitigating vertical income inequality. And then the most contentious, perhaps, expectation that we can have is that they might reverse the horizontal income inequality between parents and non-parents as well, regardless of income, right? So the question of whether parenthood actually leaves people better off or worse off financially. So far, it definitely leaves them worse off in many regards. We know that from the literature, and it will still stay that way for a long time. But again, speaking, long term, this phenomenon could potentially alter this aspect as well. And then finally, again, we should probably be happy about the higher child spending that results from these policies, but we should also think about how these policies can undermine children's agency, because as we saw earlier, if it is intended to exceed the realistic cost of children, and especially if it doesn't follow the realistic needs of children over time and between birth orders, then it's clearly not really about children, even though it's a child-related payment. So you could argue that it sort of undermines children's agency by the virtue of being a pronatalist policy. So I'm going to end there. I apologize, Safi, if I went a little over time, but I wanted to make sure that I would cover everything. And again, there is no structure for the Q&A, so I realized that no structure on my part, at least, in the sense that I realized that I covered many different aspects, and the audience might be familiar might be interested in different aspects of the topic. So feel free to ask me anything about this.